Okay, so for this fifth video, we are going to take a look at editing the light path expressions, or this channel source, right? So this little expression that we see right here for our custom lighting passes. So why you might need to do this? This is one of the few ways you can isolate objects in your renders without masks. So you could always create masks, but you can see over here I have this render pass where I only have the wood sphere, and then this one I'm rendering everything else besides the wood sphere, right? If you need to get very, very specific lighting interactions, so let's say there's like an object in your scene that you want, and it's working really well most of the time, but on one object it's just not helping, like it's causing really intense reflections and it's causing an issue, or you have a light in your scene that's lighting up everything, but for some reason it's showing up in reflections on a specific object and it's really distracting, right? You can set up custom render passes to get rid of that stuff. Okay? So I'm going to start with just showing kind of the basics of this. If you want to understand more about writing light path expressions, you're just going to have to come over to, or go over to the RenderMan document page. So it has two of them. The one that's for 21, which is usually the first one that pops up, looks like this. And so it does a pretty good job in terms of having visuals, but in my opinion, it doesn't really explain everything as well. There's this one from RenderMan 22 that does a better job. So it has, step-by-step kind of like they're just changing and using different custom expressions, and they're getting very specific results. So these are, you can see these ones, they're doing very broad changes to get very different types of lighting interactions in these renders. And then once they get further down, then they're doing very specific object and light interactions. And you can see that expression gets a little bit longer and slightly more complicated, but you can see they're isolating very specific things. So you can see here, not only are they isolating this object right here, but they're also only isolating the lighting interaction that's bouncing off of this wall. So they're getting a render pass that's just this object and how that object is interacting with the light coming off of another object, right? So you can get very specific. And why you might want to do that is, just as I said before, you might have a very specific objects and light that you're trying to control that's difficult to control otherwise, or you have you're trying to kind of create a light linking setup inside your renders, or something's just going buggy in a part of your scene, you just need to turn on or tweak that one part of your scene. Okay. So I highly recommend you guys check this out. Also, let me go ahead and bring up this other page. So if you go to the rendering folder underneath lectures, also have a custom LPE. So if you have any specific ones that you just want to copy paste, so I just described what they are, and give you the actual path that I use to do that. So you can just go ahead and use that. So there's some aspects to the formula I changed just to get slightly different results. And once you understand what's going on, it becomes a lot easier to create your own expression, right? So what are light path expressions? I didn't explain that. So light path expressions are essentially an expression that describes the render passes that are used to calculate your scene in terms of lighting, right? So our beauty pass, so what we see here, that's a light path expression that pretty much includes all lighting interactions, material interactions, and all light sources and all objects. So that's just the light path expression for that one, just includes everything, right? And then even some of the other ones that we were looking at, so when we were looking at these guys, they all have their own specific light path expressions to describe that render, right? So those are just the default ones, right? You can actually look at those. So all you have to do is add them over to your, over here into this area on the right-hand side where you're adding it to one of your own custom displays. So, right, so let me go and turn on this one. This is the one we created in like the second video. So we have our, that's where we had our direct diffuse, direct specular, indirect diffuse, indirect specular, subsurface, and we're just separating all of those render passes out. You can see here we have a formula, right, that corresponds to that um, that render pass, right? That kind of says what's being calculated inside of that render. Right? Let's go ahead and get a little closer on that. So you can see here's my, let's go to my beauty pass. Let's go ahead and just add a beauty pass to this one so we can see it more easily. Create a new node. Okay. And I'm just going to drag this up here so we can get it to the top. Okay. So you see, here is my light path expression, or the formula for my beauty pass. Okay, and it looks pretty much it's always going to have some kind of variation of this, and it might look kind of confusing, especially when you see the differences between them. But if you look up the documentation and you break it out and try it out a little bit, it gets pretty easy. There's also some things that are missing from this that RenderMan understands really easily. A lot of times, if you just don't have something present, it just includes it automatically. So it's RenderMan's pretty smart about making assumptions for what you're writing in here if you forget something. And so sometimes it's not wholly indicative of what is actually going on in this expression. So it can be a little confusing in that regard too. But let me go ahead and talk it through a little bit as best as I can understand it. I'm no expert on this at all, but this is just how I've come to understand it to help me write my own custom expressions. Okay? So C represents your camera, so your camera view, so everything that's within the camera or your currently active camera, right? Let's move over here, okay? You'll see these, oops, oh, and I'm also writing this incorrectly too. I'm gonna finish writing this off, okay? These triangular brackets are going to be, they call it a singular event. And so you don't really have to know that much, except for you'll have two parts. You'll have this first part over here, and then you'll have this second part over here, right? And we'll break that down even more. But so we'll use this for this first part. We'll have these triangular brackets just to kind of help group these guys together. Okay. So if you want to understand a little bit more, or I've just kind of explained it at like the kind of really basic level. That's not really explaining what they're actually used for, but I don't want to get into it too much. So I recommend checking out the RenderMan documentation, because I don't want this to get so complicated that you guys kind of just turn it off and don't want to try it out, right? So this right here are the type of light interactions with surfaces, right? So R stands for light that is being reflected off of a surface. So light that hits a surface and bounces off. T represents transmission or transmissive. So light that penetrates a surface and travels through a surface. So R would be like all of our basic, let's go ahead and exit out that. R would be our reflections, like our specular reflections here that we can see here. And then T would be our glass and our subsurface. So glass, the light's going into the surface and coming out. Subsurface, light's going into the surface and coming out. Reflection is light's bouncing off the surface, right? So the diffuse and specular channels are going to be our reflective channels, and then our specular and glass are going to be our transmissive channels, okay? That's pretty much what that means there. So let's go back in here, okay? And so we have these both in a bracket. So these come in together. So you'll either have just transmissive or reflective, or if you have both of them, you have both of them in your render, right? So my glass render wouldn't have the reflective component because it's just trying to calculate the transmission or the light traveling through an object instead of bouncing off of the object, okay? And if I wanted to do just that specular channel, right, I would just do R for a reflection, okay? So I'm just going to, for my beauty pass, I want both transmission and reflection, okay? So this is next square closed brackets is the types of reflections we're using for materials, right? So diffuse, right, and specular, right? So diffuse is that scattering broad surface shading effect of light bouncing off a surface and scattering. And specular is the sharp, shiny reflection. So essentially the reflections that travel together in tight groups that give us that kind of shiny, wet look to objects, right? So if I just wanted a diffuse pass, I'd only have a D. And if I only wanted the specular pass, then I'd get rid of the, I'd only have the S, okay? Okay, in between this area that we have our reflections and material types, and over this area right here where our lights are, is our, essentially this controls our bounces, right? So our light bounces. So by default, it's gonna have an asterisk, which means that it's gonna have direct bounces and indirect bounces, right? So direct bounces, if you guys recall, it's going to look like this, right? Oh, not that. This, there we go. So here we have our direct light bounces. So this is the light hits a surface and doesn't bounce anywhere else, right? So we're only seeing light coming directly from the light source, right? And indirect light bounces are going to look like this, right? Where light hits a surface and it bounces off one surface and hits another one. That's where that light's coming from. And so that's our indirect lighting, okay? So when we use that asterisk, we're getting both the direct and the indirect in the same pass, right? So it's kind of just calculating a normal lighting interactions in our scene. So both direct light and indirect light, right? So that's what the asterisk means. There we go, okay. You could replace the asterisk with two other things. So a plus means that we are skipping the direct lighting. So it's not having the direct lighting, it's only doing indirect lighting, okay? So plus means only indirect lighting bounces, right? And so what that means is it'll do bounce 1, 2, so your direct lighting is gonna be bounce 0, right? So no bounces, okay? Your indirect lighting is gonna be all the bounces after that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, however many light bounces you have in your scene, right? So plus means that you're using everything besides your direct bounce. So you're skipping 0 and you're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? You can also put nothing, which means light path 0 or bounce path bounce light bounce 0, right? So the direct lighting. So if you have nothing, it's direct lighting. If you have plus, it's all of your indirect lighting. And if you have the asterisk, it's both direct and indirect lighting. Okay. You can look this up. We're not going to try this out too much, but you can also use curly brackets to actually specify which light pass or bounce pass you want. So you could use 0, right? So that could be the direct lighting, or you could do like light from 1 to 3, right? Or 2 to 3, or just 3. I'm probably writing this wrong because I have less experience writing this out, but you can actually specify the specific light bounce passes you want, okay? So we're going to just use the asterisk because we're going to use direct and indirect lighting. Okay, the second area over here is our light sources. So what lights are we using in our scene? So by default, inside of this, these triangular brackets, you have this L period. And what that does is it's going to include every single light in your scene. Okay, so all light sources. The O is going to be the light coming from your emissive objects. So that's what we did in the previous video to get rid of the emissive ring in my scene. So to get that to stop casting light in my renders or showing up in my renders, I just deleted that O. And then when we wanted just the emissive light, let's go ahead and expand that. So when we wanted just the emissive light, right, in the render pass, then we just deleted the L brackets part. And so that was getting rid of all of our light sources in that render pass and only showing the emissive light. So here's when we deleted the O, and here's when we deleted the L brackets. Okay. So this is also where if we were doing it by hand, we could also, this is where we could also do our light groups. So you can actually define your light groups after this period. So you can call, like if I said key, put those in singular quotation marks. Then it will render only for the lights, it'll only render the lights that have the key light group assigned to them, right? Same thing as if we went here and did key, right? Let's go ahead and delete that. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use this beauty render So we have this test beauty render I have here. I just find a new one. And so this right here with everything included should just be a normal beauty render. And I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to get rid of reflecting light. So we're only going to be rendering the transmissive. So let's see how that looks. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click render, pause it until it's done. Okay, so you guys can see here, unfortunately, I'm still getting that really obnoxious emissive object that likes to pop up in all my renders, which I could just delete the O in my path to get rid of. I'll leave it for now. But so I got rid of the R. So now my beauty render is only showing transmissive interactions of light. So that's light transmitting through an object, not reflecting off an object, right? So my glass and my subsurface are showing up, but all my other objects where light's bouncing off of the surface are not showing up because I'm not calculating reflections. Okay, so let's go ahead and try the inverse of that. We're going to get rid of the T and we're only going to include the R. Okay, so I'm going to have to pause until it's done processing and thinking about itself. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the T and replace it with a capital R. Press enter. I didn't mention this before, but anytime you're typing in a custom LPE or a custom channel source, when you do so, press enter to make sure that you lock it in. Sometimes it doesn't remember it. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and click render and pause it till. Okay, so you can see here, this was with our transmissive. So we're only showing the transmissive light interaction, so light penetrating surface. And here's reflective, so only light interactions that are reflecting off of a surface. So you can see here with this glass globe, it's black on the inside because light's not allowed to go through it in this render because we're not calculating that. My statue is still showing up because my statue has both reflective components and transmissive components, right? So I have diffuse and specular on it, and I also have subsurface on it, which is letting light enter the surface as well. So that's how you can see this is without the subsurface, right? So this is when I'm only doing the reflectance, right? Here's my normal beauty pass where I have both. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and move on to the DNS. So I'm going to go ahead and add the T back for transmissive. Let's go ahead and get rid of the D and then just do specular. Let's go ahead and click render and pause until it's done. Okay, so you can see I don't have diffuse shading components in here anymore. I have just the specular reflections. So I have my diffuse reflections are turned off, but my specular reflections are still on, right? And then transmissive, and it's both transmissive and reflective, so we're still getting transmitted light coming in through it. But you can see here, I got rid of the D in that formula, and now it's only showing S or specular. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do next is we can skip the, showing it only with D and turning off S. But there's also, so when we talked in the previous, one of the previous videos, I think it was the second one, about different lobes. So there, if you look in your custom, or the standard, not standard, but the included lighting passes, some of them have are called lobes, right? So you can see here we have like our clear coat, rough lobe, glass lobe, right? And you'll see if I highlight over it, you can see here that it's using a slightly different formula. So you can see in here, let's zoom in on that. So it's using TS8. So that S8 means specular lobe 8, which happens to be glass for fixed surface, right? So if you ever want to use any of those, so for instance, if I wanted the transmissive pass, but I only wanted the glass and not the subsurface, because remember, transmission affects both glass and subsurface. But if I only wanted the glass, then I could use that specific material property S8, which is specular lobe 8, which is glass. So subsurface would be another one. I'm not sure what it is off the top of my head, but we could probably just click on it. Let's go find subsurface. Okay. And so, well, I guess in this case, what they're doing is because subsurface only has diffuse in it, they're doing transmission, but only diffuse. Okay. You can see the formula is getting a little bit more complicated and tricky in terms of its layout. So you can see it not only does it have transmission and diffuse, it also has in brackets diffuse and specular. And that's essentially, you can add any number of events. So you can do combinations of types of reflections and types of material passes, but I don't want to get too far into that, mostly because I probably would struggle in front of you guys getting the right syntax for writing them and troubleshooting. And it's probably outside of what you guys specifically need. If you're getting to that level, I recommend checking out that video or that documentation for the LPEs. Okay, so let's go back to our guy here. Okay, so I'm going to add the D back to the DS, and I'm going to go ahead and now I'm going to replace this asterisk with a plus, right? So remember, asterisk does direct and indirect light bounces. This one's going to be just indirect light bounces. Okay, so let's go ahead and zoom back out and click render. Okay, so let me go ahead and get this. Okay, there we go. All right, so I had to pause because Runnerman crashed, and also I found I don't fully understand writing the LPs as I thought I did. So I'm discovering new things as I'm doing this, but suffice it to say that second component between that first area where we're talking about our lighting interactions with our materials and the second area where we're talking about our light sources, right? Right? This area right here where that asterisk was is how many, or essentially what bounce passes we're focusing on. So I said asterisk is everything, right? So, and that still holds to be true. Plus is not necessarily just indirect lighting. So don't take my word for that. I recommend if you're trying to get just indirect lighting for custom passes, to go ahead and write your own just try to look up the documentation. I found a workaround because it wasn't working for me, and that is to use the brackets method. So in the brackets method, if you include just inside the curly brackets, if you include just a number, it's going to render just that bounce path number, right? So the second bounce on, this one's only going to render the second time the lights bounce, not the first and nothing after that, right? If you use a comma in there, then it does like a min-max sort of situation, right? So it starts at bounce number 2 and then calculates up to bounce number 5. It doesn't go any further, right? And so we can leave this empty, so this will go from all the bounce passes up to the fifth bounce, the fifth time the lights bounce around. And then this one, if I leave the second one empty, it only starts calculating or rendering the second light bounce onward. So by doing that, I got something essentially a similar or akin to my indirect diffuse and indirect specular passes combined into one, right? I did a little tweak to it as well as I just made sure I was only doing the reflectance because the indirect diffuse and indirect specular channels are only using reflectance anyways. But all that to say, if you ever want to kind of learn a little bit more about how to emulate these render passes, just look at the formula they use. So that kind of helps me out a little bit. Okay, so let's move on. So let's go ahead and I want to set this back. So another thing that's kind of handy as well is period represents, essentially acts as a wildcard for that component of this expression. So if instead of the brackets RT, so we had RT bracket, right? So instead of that, if I select all that and replace it with a period, that's going to do is it's going to assume that R and T, right? Not going to assume just R or just T. It's just going to be like, okay, you mean both R and T. It's just a shorthand, so you don't have to have like a really long expression. It just means everything for that component. If I want both diffuse and specular, I could also replace this with a period. So now, if my expression has inside of these brackets period, period, then that means that it's going to go ahead and include both the reflective, transmissive, diffuse, and specular, all 4 of those. Okay. So let's go ahead and try rendering that out and see if this proves me a liar or not. I hope it doesn't. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pause. Okay, so it seemed like it worked. The only difference is I added the transmissive back in, so you can see the glass and the subsurface. Added that T back in there, so the glass and subsurface are back in there. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is, 1 second. Okay. So now we're going to take a look at this last part of our expression. So let's go back in here. And I'm also going to ahead and return this back to being an asterisk. So we'll just do asterisk. Okay. So it'll include the direct and indirect, essentially all the light bounces in there. So in here, we have our light sources, and here we have our emissive objects. So we took a look at the last video. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but in our last video, to get rid of the emissive objects, so the like objects that had glow on them, we just deleted the O. And to turn off all of our lights, we just deleted this part and included just the O. So it was only the emissive objects, right? And I just said earlier, if we wanted to do light linking, or not light linking, light groups, we could just put single quotations and just name our light group. Okay. So what I'm going to do is show how you guys can, instead of having a render pass that's focusing only on one light group, we can do everything except for this light group. So excluding the light group. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to put these in square brackets right here. And then we're going to use a caret. So this caret right here is essentially means don't include, or except, or not. One of those two, or three. So let's go ahead and try that out. Okay, I'm going to pause it. Okay, so I went ahead and let it render. So here we can see this is our custom light path where we're using that caret or Shift-6 to get that symbol on a standard keyboard. So that caret to get rid of the key light group. So you can see that light group that had the key light in it is not part of the render, right? And then comparing that to our one we have it on as well. Okay. So what we can also do is we can also use that to isolate objects in our scene. So far we've isolated or gotten rid of lights or groups of lights, but we can do that with objects in our scene as well. Okay, so in order to do that, we're going to use something called, what lights use is a light group, and what everything else uses is called an LPE group. Okay, so in order to find an LPE group, what we're going to do is we're going to come over to our attribute editor for an object. So I'm going to use this ball in the foreground, for example. Okay, and we're going to find the shape node for that object. So we're going to go ahead and click on the shape node. Come down to render stats. Oh, sorry. Is it? No. I'm sorry, not the shape node, the transform node. So the first tab. So you go to RenderMan, and there is, you can see here, a shading tab underneath RenderMan. And so here, just like with light group, we have something called LPE groups, right? And so it works just like the light groups, except for they don't include a handy drop-down menu to automatically assign it. So here's where you actually have to assign or use the custom LPEs or tweak it yourself in order to get that, isolate that object in the render pass, right? So I already have these in here. We have wood and no wood, right? So it's just the same as, more or less just the same as using it for the light groups on the light, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and go over to my, here. Okay. So we're gonna grab this guy. And I'm gonna, oops, let's delete that, I accidentally added that. So, right, so we have that period, right? So this period represents both reflection and transmission, or R and T. This period right here represents both diffuse and specular reflections. And I'm gonna add a bracket here, just like I did over here with the key. I'm going to go ahead and put it into square brackets, put it into single quotation marks, and type in the name of my LPE group. So let's go ahead and, I don't know if I set LPE group yet. So we're going to call this one wood ball. Okay. So I'm just going to call it wood ball, press enter. And then I'm going to come back over here, and then I'm going to type that into my open quotation marks. So wood ball. Okay, press enter to save it. Okay. And now I'm going to go ahead and click render and pause it. Okay, and so here we go. And again, I have to delete the O to get rid of the emissive light coming off of that object. But you can see here that it's only, besides that annoying little oversight on my part, it's rendered everything except for the ball, right? And so I can go ahead and go back to my expression, and just like I did with the key light, and again, it's also actually not using the key light as well because I'm excluding the key light. So you can see my normal render, yeah, that top lighting on that ball. But you can see here, I don't have that because I'm also excluding the key light in this. So just like with the key light, I'm just going to put a caret right before the single quotation marks, right? So, just add that little caret. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and render it again. And I'll pause. So you can see here, here was just with the ball, and here's without the ball. So I can have two render passes, one with the ball, one without the ball, if I felt like I need to isolate the ball for some reason, right? And so if you check out, this is essentially all I really wanted to cover with the custom render passes and how we can isolate objects in our scene in our render passes. You can use masks and you can get the same effect as I'm getting right here, but there's only so much you can do with masks. So masks will let you isolate the object itself, but if you want to isolate, like I said in an earlier part of this video, specific lighting interactions between objects and between specific objects and specific lights, right? Then creating custom LPEs can really help you kind of get that, have that flexibility and have that ability, right? So like I said, I recommend checking out the LPE documentation page for RenderMan. I also recommend a really good starting video for learning this stuff is Small Robot Studios render video. And he goes into setting up render passes, and he actually does specific light paths for a specific light, like so essentially a specific light group on a specific object. So we can have a specific or a separate render pass for that rim light on the amp, right? So you can see here, he had, that rim light could be catching all these other objects and spilling onto the ground, but he went ahead and he created a render pass just isolating that
turning off
light
denoise
and that object in a single
and
pass.
obviously I can't show you the other channel because
so that's pretty much it. So I recommend checking out those resources if you want to know more. Like I said, there's probably a lot I'm misrepresenting, and I'm not an expert on this at all. But this is just kind of like a sample of how you can create your own custom light path expressions. Okay. And so that's it for this video. The next video will probably be setting up mat IDs and masks and using CryptoMat.